The emergency klaxons wailed through the corridors of the research vessel Prometheus as Dr. Sarah Chon rushed toward the communications array. Her hands trembled not from fear, but from the crushing weight of realization. The data streaming in from the outer rim told a story she wished she could rewrite. "Ma'am, we're receiving another distress signal," called Lieutenant Rodriguez from his station, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. This time from the Corvin Collective. Their entire industrial complex has stopped. The workers are refusing to enter the processing plants. Sarah closed her eyes, remembering the day 3 months ago when she'd stood before the Deathworld Alliance with such pride, such certainty that humanity's greatest gift, hope itself, would transform these harsh civilizations for the better. The empathy engine had been her life's work, a neural interface designed to share human, emotional constructs with species who had evolved without them. The first test subject had been Threkfer himself, a Kethran ambassador whose people had mined toxic crystals in crushing atmospheric pressure for over 10,000 years. She could still see his compound eyes dilating as the device activated, his scarred carapace trembling as he experienced his first taste of human hope. The irrational, beautiful belief that tomorrow could be different from today. "Doctor," came a gravelly voice from behind her. She turned to see Commander Marcus Webb, the military liaison assigned to oversee the cultural exchange program. His weathered face bore the kind of deep lines that came from making hard decisions in impossible situations. "We need to talk." Sarah followed him to his private office, past walls lined with commendations from a dozen different campaigns. Webb had fought in the Centauri uprising and survived the siege of New Titan. He understood warfare, but this was something beyond battle. This was watching entire civilizations crumble from within. "The casualty reports are coming in faster than we can process them," Webb said, activating a holographic display that filled the room with red warning icons. Each one represented a world in crisis. The Hadean Collective has reported a 300% increase in what they're calling voluntary cessation of function. The Vulcan clans are tearing themselves apart in civil wars that make no strategic sense. And the Kethran mining operations. He paused, his voice catching slightly. "Sarah, entire mining crews are walking out into the toxic atmosphere without protective gear. They're choosing death over returning to work they now see as unbearable." The weight of it hit her like a physical blow. These weren't just statistics, they were billions of beings whose ancestors had survived the harshest conditions in the galaxy through pure, stoic acceptance of their fate. She had given them the ability to dream of something better, never considering that for some species, dreams could be more dangerous than the most lethal predator. "I need to go back," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to see what we've done. The Alliance has declared the Terran diplomatic corps persona non grata in their space," Webb replied grimly. "But there might be another way. I've been in contact with the smuggler Captain Rico Valdez of the Stellar Drift. He's willing to take a small team into Alliance territory, off the books." Sarah nodded, understanding the implications. This would be a black operation, unsanctioned by Earth Command. If they were caught, it would be considered an act of war. But she had to see the consequences of her gift firsthand. She had to understand how hope, humanity's most precious emotion, had become a weapon of mass destruction. As they began planning their clandestine mission, neither of them noticed the small device hidden in Webb's desk drawer. Another empathy engine, its crystalline surface pulsing softly with an inner light. Webb had taken it weeks ago, ostensibly for security analysis. But late at night, when the guilt became too much to bear, he found himself wondering what it would feel like to experience the kind of hope that could drive someone to walk naked into a toxic storm rather than accept another day of unbearable existence. The Prometheus continued its journey through the void, carrying with it the weight of unintended consequences, and the terrible knowledge that sometimes the greatest gifts can become the cruelest curses. Asterisk, asterisk. The stellar drift was not a ship built for comfort or beauty. It was a survivor, much like its captain. Rico Valdez had spent 20 years running contraband through the galaxy's most dangerous sectors, and his vessel bore the scars of that experience. Patched hull plating told stories of asteroid impacts and plasma burns, while the jury-rigged systems hummed with the constant threat of catastrophic failure. "Welcome aboard the finest rust bucket in the outer rim," Valdez said with a sardonic grin as Sarah and her small team boarded. The captain was a lean man in his 50s, with cybernetic implants covering half his face, souvenirs from a smuggling run gone wrong in the Vega system. "I hope you folks aren't expecting luxury accommodations, because you're about to be disappointed." Sarah's team consisted of 4 specialists. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a Zenith psychologist who had studied Deathworld species for over a decade. Tech specialist Jonas Kim, who maintained the empathy engine prototypes. Commander Webb, representing military interests. And Sarah herself, carrying the terrible burden of her creation's consequences. As they departed Earth space under false registration codes, Vasquez reviewed the latest intelligence reports with growing alarm. "The psychological profiles we're seeing don't match anything in the literature," she said, her dark eyes reflecting the glow of her tablet. "These species evolved specific neural pathways to suppress what humans would call dissatisfaction or longing. Their brains literally cannot process the concept of wanting something they cannot have without experiencing severe psychological trauma." Kim looked up from his maintenance of the backup empathy engine they brought for analysis. "The original design parameters never accounted for species with fundamentally different emotional architectures," he admitted. "We assumed that hope was a universal positive, that all sentient beings would benefit from optimism about the future." "Assumptions," Webb muttered from his position at the tactical console. "That's what got us into this mess. We projected human values onto alien minds without considering that maybe, just maybe, their way of thinking evolved for a damn good reason." Their first destination was Kepler 442b, a world where the Hadean Collective had established mining operations in the planet's sulfuric acid oceans. The journey took 3 days through hyperspace, 3 days for the team to contemplate the magnitude of their mission and what they might find. When they dropped out of hyperspace near Kepler 442b, the sight that greeted them was devastating. The orbital platforms that had housed millions of Hadean workers were dark, their industrial sections cold and lifeless. Debris fields suggested that some stations had been deliberately destroyed, while others drifted empty through space like metal tombs. "My God," Vasquez whispered as they approached the largest platform. "The population readings are. They're showing less than 10% of normal occupancy." Valdez guided his ship toward a docking bay that seemed to be one of the few still operational. The automated systems granted them permission to dock, though the mechanical voice that guided them sounded hollow and lifeless programmed responses. From a station whose inhabitants have largely vanished, the docking bay was a cathedral of industrial architecture, designed to accommodate the massive bulk haulers that carried processed materials to other worlds. Now it stood nearly empty, their small ship dwarfed by the cavernous space around them. The air recycling system still functioned, but the atmosphere felt stagnant, charged with the weight of abandonment. Their contact was a Hadean named Krelthara, one of the few administrative personnel who had remained at their posts. Hadeans were amphibious beings evolved from the acid seas of their homeworld, with translucent skin that revealed the complex circulatory systems beneath. Krelthara's body showed signs of severe stress-discolored patches with the acid-resistant. Membranes had begun to break down. "You should not have come here," Krelthara said through a translation device, their voice carrying harmonics that spoke of deep exhaustion. The gift you brought us has torn apart everything we built over millennia. Our people no longer accept. That suffering has meaning. They have learned to want things that cannot exist. Sarah stepped forward, her heart heavy with guilt. We never intended— Intentions, Krelthara interrupted, their four arms gesturing in what their species considered a sign of profound grief. Your intentions were bright and beautiful, like the bioluminescent parasites that lure our young to their deaths in the deep trenches. We survived by accepting that life is struggle, that pain has purpose, that endurance itself is victory. You taught us to dream of worlds without acid rain, of lives without constant threat of dissolution. Now our people walk into the processing chambers without protective suits, choosing swift death over lives they have learned to see as meaningless. The tour that followed was a journey through a civilization in collapse. Empty corridors that had once buzzed with activity, abandoned workstations where sophisticated mining equipment sat idle, and worst of all, the memorial walls where the names of the voluntarily ceased were inscribed in flowing Hadean script thousands upon thousands of beings who had chosen death over a life they could no longer accept. As they prepared to leave for their next destination, Webb pulled Sarah aside. This is just the beginning, he said quietly. If this is what's happened to one of the more stable Alliance species, I'm afraid to see what we've done to the others. The Vulcan homeworld of Ignis Tertius was a hellscape of active volcanism and crushing gravity, where the indigenous species had evolved into the galaxy's most formidable warriors. For over 50,000 years, the Vulcan clans had maintained a complex balance of perpetual warfare, not the chaotic violence of primitive species, but a sophisticated system of ritualized combat that channeled their aggressive instincts into societal stability. When the stellar drift emerged from hyperspace, at the edge of the Ignis system, they found themselves in the middle of what could only be described as apocalyptic chaos. Massive warships bearing the insignia of different Vulcan clans were engaged in brutal combat. But these weren't the precise, honor-bound duels that had characterized Vulcan warfare for millennia. These were desperate, savage battles with no apparent strategic purpose. Jesus Christ, Valdez muttered as he maneuvered his ship through the debris field of destroyed vessels. It's like they've all gone completely insane. Dr. Vasquez was monitoring the communication channels, her face pale as she translated the intercepted transmissions. They're not fighting over resources or territory, she reported. The battle chatter suggests they're fighting because they no longer understand why they've been fighting for so long. Some clans are demanding an end to all warfare, while others are trying to exterminate them for what they see as weakness. The planet's surface was even worse. Where once great fortress cities had stood in eternal siege configuration architectural, marvels designed to withstand both volcanic activity and constant warfare, now only ruins remained. Some had been abandoned entirely, while others showed signs of internal conflict, so severe that the defenders had torn apart their own fortifications. Their contact was a Vulcan warrior named Drakmor of the Emberforge clan, one of the few remaining traditionalists who still maintained the old ways. They met him in what had once been the sacred war council chambers of his clan's primary fortress, now little more than a cave system carved into a volcanic ridge. Drakmor was an impressive specimen even by Vulcan standards, nearly 3 meters tall, with the characteristic silicon-based carapace that allowed his species to survive in extreme heat. His body bore the ritual scars of 1,000 battles, each one telling a story of honor maintained and duty fulfilled. But his eyes held something Sarah had never seen in a Vulcan warrior before: profound confusion. "You have unmade us," Drakmor said in his species' harsh, guttural language, each word weighted with centuries of tradition. "For 50 millennia, we have known our purpose. We fight because fighting is what we are. We do not question why the strong must test themselves against the strong, why blood must be spilled to maintain the balance. We simply accept and fulfill our nature. He gestured toward the ruined chamber around them, where broken weapon displays and shattered honor totems told the story of a civilization destroying itself. Your gift taught my people to ask questions that have no answers. Why must we fight? Why must our children be trained for war from the moment they can hold a blade? Why must we accept that violence is our destiny? Sarah felt sick as she began to understand the true scope of the catastrophe. Some of your people wanted to stop fighting entirely? The peaceful clans, Drakmor spat, using a term that was clearly an obscenity in his language. They experienced your hope and decided that our entire way of life was meaningless suffering. They laid down their weapons and declared that the age of warfare was over. Do you understand what this means? For a species bred for combat? It means civil war more devastating than anything in our history, because now we fight not for honor or territory, but for the right to exist as we are. Dr. Vasquez stepped forward carefully. What happened to the peaceful clans? Drakmor's massive head turned toward her, and for a moment, Sarah thought she saw something like grief in his alien features. Some died defending their philosophy with the very violence they claimed to reject. Others walked into the lava flows, choosing death over the internal contradiction your gift created in their minds. The rest were hunted down by clans, who saw their pacifism as a virus that would destroy everything we are. The full horror of the situation became clear as Drakmor led them through the ruins of his clan's territory. Entire generations of Vulcan warriors, raised from birth to find meaning in combat, had suddenly been given the ability to imagine a life without violence. For some, this had led to the desperate desire for peace. For others, it had created an existential crisis so profound that they could no longer function. Your people survived by accepting their role as warriors, Sarah said, trying to process the magnitude of the unintended consequences. Hope made them question not just their circumstances, but their fundamental identity as a species. Hope. Drakmor repeated, the word sounding like a curse in his mouth. Yes, that is what you called it. The belief that things can be different than they are. But we are what millions of years of evolution made us. We cannot be other than warriors, no matter how much we might suddenly wish to be. Your gift taught us to want the impossible, and the wanting is destroying us. As they prepared to leave Ignis Tertius, the team witnessed one final tragedy. A group of young Vulcan warriors, barely adults by their species standards, had gathered at the edge of a massive lava lake. They stood in perfect formation, their weapons cast aside, singing what Drakmor explained was a death song, not the triumphant battle hymn traditionally sung before glorious combat, but a new composition that spoke of the agony of existing, between what they were and what they now dreamed they could be. One by one, they walked into the molten rock, choosing death over the impossible contradiction of being warriors who no longer believed in war. We need to stop this, Webb said as they watched the final warrior disappear into the lava. Whatever it takes, we need to find a way to undo what we've done. But even as he spoke, they all knew the terrible truth. Hope, once given, could not be taken back. The gift had been delivered, and now entire civilizations were paying the price for humanity's good intentions. Asterisk. The Kethrin homeworld of Mordrith was a testament to the power of adaptation over beauty. Centuries of industrial mining had stripped away most of the planet's surface vegetation, leaving behind a landscape of deep quarries and toxic waste lakes beneath a perpetually overcast sky. The atmosphere was thick with particulates that would kill most species within minutes. But the Kethrins had evolved to not just survive, but thrive in these conditions. As the stellar drift descended through the poisonous atmosphere, Sarah pressed her face to the viewport and tried to comprehend what she was seeing. The massive mining complexes that had operated continuously for over 2,000 years, stood silent and abandoned. Conveyor systems that had moved millions of tons of rare Earth elements daily were motionless, their metal frameworks already beginning to corrode in the acidic air. The economic impact alone must be staggering, Dr. Vasquez observed as she reviewed the planetary data. The Catherine operations supplied raw materials for half the manufacturing in Alliance space. If they've stopped production entirely, the entire interstellar economy could collapse, Webb finished grimly. But that's not even the worst part. Look at the population centers. The cities of Mordrith had been built around the mining operations, dense urban areas where millions of Catherines lived in carefully climate-controlled environments. Now, many of these settlements showed signs of massive population displacement. Entire districts had been abandoned, while others showed evidence of civil unrest on a scale that defied comprehension. Their guide was Ambassador Threkvar himself, the same Catherine who had been the first to experience the empathy engine months. Earlier, Sarah barely recognized him. Where once he had carried himself with the stoic dignity of his species, now he seemed diminished, his scarred carapace dulled, and his movements uncertain. "You have come to witness the fruit of your gift," Threkvar said as he led them through the abandoned streets of Quarry City 7. His voice, filtered through the atmospheric breathing apparatus all Catherines wore, carried a weight of exhaustion that seemed to permeate the very air around them. "I suppose you deserve to see what hope looks like when it collides with reality." The tour began in the residential districts, where entire apartment blocks stood empty. The Catherine aesthetic was brutally functional living spaces designed for efficiency rather than comfort, built to house workers whose entire existence revolved around extracting valuable minerals from the planet's toxic core. "For 60 generations, my people have lived this way," Threkvar explained as they passed through a typical Cathron dwelling. The space was cramped and utilitarian, with surfaces designed to be easily cleaned of the corrosive dust that inevitably infiltrated any enclosed space on Mordrith. "We knew no other life was possible. We accepted that we were born to dig, that our children would dig, that our species existed to extract wealth from poisoned ground." "And then you experienced the empathy engine," Sarah said quietly. Threkvar stopped walking and turned to face her, his compound eyes reflecting the dim light filtering through the toxic atmosphere. "Yes, for the first time in the history of my species, I felt what it was like to believe that existence could be ... more. I experienced the human concept of aspiration, the belief that one's circumstances could be fundamentally altered through will and effort." They continued to what had once been the central mining complex, a vast industrial cathedral where thousands of Catherines had worked in carefully choreographed shifts to maintain constant production. The machinery stood silent, now covered in a thin layer of the corrosive dust that would eventually consume it entirely. The first strikes began within days of the empathy engine's introduction, Threkvar continued. Workers who had never questioned their role suddenly found themselves unable to enter the mining shafts. They had learned to want things they had, never conceived of before: clean air, natural light, lives that extended beyond the extraction of minerals. Dr. Vasquez knelt beside one of the massive drilling platforms, running her hand along its corroded surface. But surely some accommodation could have been reached? Improved working conditions, better safety protocols? Threkvar's breathing apparatus made a sound that might have been laughter if his species were capable of finding humor in tragedy. "You still don't understand. The problem wasn't that working conditions were poor. The problem was that we suddenly realized working conditions existed at all. For millennia, we had lived without the concept of choice. Mining wasn't something we did. It was something we were." The true horror of the situation became clear as they descended into the abandoned mine shafts. The tunnels stretched for kilometers. Into the planet's crust, a three-dimensional maze of extraction points and transportation. networks that represented the accumulated labor of thousands of generations. But now, instead of the constant activity that had characterized these spaces for centuries, there was only silence. Many of my people tried to return to work after the initial strikes, Threkver explained as they walked through a main thoroughfare, wide enough to accommodate the massive hauling equipment. They understood intellectually that our entire civilization depended on continued production. But the hope you gave us had poisoned their ability to accept what they now saw as meaningless suffering. What happened to them? Webb asked, though. His tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Some gathered in the abandoned sections of the mines and tried to create new communities, based on human concepts of fulfillment and self-actualization, Threkver replied. They lasted perhaps a month before the reality of our environment reasserted itself. Others attempted to leave Mordrith entirely, seeking the clean worlds they had learned to dream about. Of course, we had never developed the technology for mass interstellar travel because we had never needed it. We were content to remain where we were born. The final stop on their tour was the memorial complex that had been constructed near the planet's main spaceport. Here, carved into black stone that could withstand Mordrith's corrosive atmosphere, were the names of the thousands of Kethrans who had been unable to reconcile their new capacity for hope with the fundamental realities of their existence. They walked out onto the surface without environmental suits, Threkver said as they stood before the memorial wall. Not from despair, but from a kind of terrible optimism. They had learned to believe that wanting something badly enough could make it real. They walked into our toxic atmosphere, believing that their hope could somehow transform poison into breathable air. Sarah felt tears burning her eyes as she read the seemingly endless list of names, each one representing a being whose death was a direct consequence of her gift. "We never meant for this to happen," she whispered. "I know," Threkver replied. "That is perhaps the most tragic part of all. Your intentions were pure, your desire to help genuine. But hope, Dr. Chun, is not a universal good. For some of us, acceptance was not surrender, it was survival." As they prepared to leave Mordrith, Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She had to find a way to undo what she had done, to somehow extract the gift of hope from species who were dying from its presence. The question was whether such a thing was even possible, and whether the cure might prove even more devastating than the disease. Asterisk. 6 months after the introduction of the empathy engine, the stellar drift arrived at the neutral station designated for the emergency summit between the Terran diplomatic corps and what remained of the Deathworld Alliance leadership. The meeting was to take place aboard Haven Station, a massive research facility built into an asteroid in the disputed territory between human and Alliance space. Sarah had spent the journey developing what she hoped might be a solution, a reverse-engineered version of the empathy engine that could theoretically suppress the human emotional constructs she had inadvertently introduced to the Alliance species. The technology was untested and potentially dangerous, but as reports continued to flood in of entire civilizations collapsing under the weight of newfound hope, desperate measures seemed justified. The station's main conference hall was a study in contrasts. On one side sat the human delegation Sarah, Webb, and a handful of diplomats and scientists from Earth Command. On the other sat the survivors, Threkver, looking even more diminished than before, Drakmor, his warrior's bearing now tempered by profound exhaustion, Krell Thara of the Hadian Collective, their translucent skin showing stress patterns that suggested they were near the end of their physiological endurance. But it was the fourth member of the Alliance delegation who commanded everyone's attention. Zix Thara was an Exari, one of the rare species that served as neutral mediators between the various Deathworld civilizations. Her people had evolved on a planet where survival required the ability to perfectly understand and adapt to the psychological states of other species They were living empaths, capable of experiencing the emotional reality of any being they encountered. "Before we begin," Sixthara said, her voice carrying harmonics that spoke directly to the emotional centers of every brain in the room, "I must share with you what I have witnessed. The Nexari have served as counselors and mediators for the Alliance for over 1,000 years. We have helped species resolve conflicts by allowing them to truly understand each other's perspectives. But what humanity has done transcends mere cultural exchange. You have fundamentally altered the neural architecture of entire civilizations." She activated a holographic display that filled the center of the room with complex neurological charts. "These are brain scans of Alliance species before and after exposure to the empathy engine. The human emotional constructs have not simply been overlaid on existing neural patterns. They have rewired fundamental cognitive processes that evolved over millions of years." Dr. Vasquez leaned forward, studying the data with growing alarm. "The changes aren't just psychological. They're neuroplastic alterations at the cellular level. The affected individuals literally cannot return to their previous state of consciousness." "Precisely," Sixthara confirmed. "And the tragedy compounds itself, because those who have been affected now experience the loss of their former mental state as another form of grief. They mourn not just for their changed circumstances, but for their lost ability to accept those circumstances." Sarah stood slowly, her legs feeling weak as the full magnitude of what she had done finally hit her. "The reverse-engineered device I've developed, it won't work, will it? Even if it could suppress the human emotional constructs," Sixthara replied gently. "The neural pathways have been permanently altered. To remove hope now would not restore acceptance. It would simply create beings capable of seeing beauty. They can no longer feel. Aware of possibilities they can no longer embrace. The cure would be worse than the disease." The silence that followed was profound and terrible. Webb was the first to break it, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "So what you're saying is that we've committed genocide through kindness. We've destroyed entire civilizations by trying to help them." "Not genocide," Threkver corrected, his breathing apparatus wheezing with the effort of speech. "Transformation. Our species are not dead. We are becoming something else. Something that perhaps cannot survive in the environments that shaped us. We are evolving, Dr. Chun, but evolution without environmental pressure is often fatal." Drakmore stood then, his massive frame casting shadows across the conference room. "There is a human concept I have learned from your gift, the idea of taking responsibility for unintended consequences. My people have a tradition. When a warrior's actions, however well-intentioned, bring dishonor to their clan, they must carry that burden until it can be transformed into wisdom." "What are you suggesting?" Sarah asked. "That you join us," Krelthara said, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. "That you come to our worlds and help us learn to live with the gift you've given us. If hope is to be our curse, then perhaps it must also become our salvation." The proposal was unprecedented humans living permanently in Alliance space, not as diplomats or scientists, but as permanent residents working to help entire civilizations adapt to their altered mental states. It would mean abandoning Earth, accepting exile in worlds that were hostile to human physiology, and dedicating their lives to managing the consequences of their actions. "I'll go," Sarah said without hesitation. "It's my responsibility." "We'll all go," Webb added, looking around at the small team that had witnessed the devastation firsthand. "If there's even a chance we can help these people adapt instead of just dying from our gift, then we have to try." Over the following hours, they outlined a plan that was part penance, part experiment. Human volunteers would be stationed on each of the major Alliance worlds, working with local populations to develop new social structures that could accommodate both the harsh realities of Deathworld existence and the dangerous gift of human-style hope. It would take generations, and success was far from guaranteed. But as Sarah looked around the conference room at the faces of beings whose entire civilizations had been transformed by her good intentions, she realized that some responsibilities could not be escaped, only embraced. A gift of hope had been given, and now the real work would begin teaching entire species how to dream without dying from the beauty of their impossible aspirations. The stellar drift departed Haven Station, carrying not just Sarah and her team back to Earth to recruit volunteers, but also the weight of understanding that the universe's greatest tragedies often spring from its purest intentions. Hope, humanity had learned, was indeed a gift, but like all truly powerful gifts, it carried a price that the receiver might not be able to afford. Yet, in the end, perhaps that was the most human response of all, to face the consequences of their actions, not with despair, but with the same dangerous hope that had started everything, believing that somehow, someway, even the most terrible mistakes could be transformed into something meaningful. The alliance between humanity and the Deathworlds would continue, but it would be built not on the sharing of gifts, but on the shared burden of learning to live with the consequences of good intentions gone wrong. And in that sharing, perhaps both species would discover new forms of strength that neither could have achieved alone. Asterisk.